Hi, everybody, and welcome to Project 180. These are live sessions that we're doing with interesting project managers from all over the world. Today, we've got Rosemary Cheredaryk. How's it going?
Honestly, things are really good. I recently started a job as an operations manager at a small consulting company, which is an interesting side of project management. Definitely a new challenge. I'm enjoying it a lot.
That's great. Congratulations on the new gig.
Thank you.
When we first met, it's been a while, but like it was last fall, right, that we first met and
Yeah.
kind of started chatting a bit about project management stuff. There was a really interesting book, I guess, that we were talking about, and this theory of loving the problem that was like a light bulb moment for me. So I really wanted to follow up with you. It's taken us a while to get there, but I really wanted to follow up with you about it because you were so keen on this whole concept of project management and often can be dubbed problem management, challenge management, right? So, but the idea of not getting caught up in frustration and trying to manage the project you're working on. This whole idea of loving the problem, I thought was just genius. But I know it's not it's not necessarily new. But I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit about the background of this theory and why it impacted you so much.
Absolutely. Also, I want to call out problem management. I love that as an alternative to project management. It is so true. So the full quote or the full mindset is falling in love with the problem and not the solution. It's a book that was originally written about startups. I don't necessarily recommend the book. I do disagree with some of the opinions in it, but I think that kind of goes for most things in the business world is it's better to pick and choose what works for you than to be prescriptive. If we think
Yeah.
about project management, generally I prefer hybrid projects over fully agile or fully waterfall. So in terms of how falling in love with the problem and not the solution looks for me as a project manager, it's really about focusing on and committing to the problem that you're trying to solve rather than committing to the solution that has been selected to solve the problem, which is essentially the project. The project is the what or the how, but the problem itself is the why. Why are we actually doing this project? And I think that when you focus on the why, the what is being solved, and not just, how are we solving it? What are we implementing? I find that I have much more successful projects. And so it's changed my project management in a big way. And I think is one of the major reasons that I've had success for so many projects.
That's it's just nice, I guess, flipping of perspectives, right? You're not necessarily working on a project trying to figure out every little difficulty along the way. You're talking about focusing on the goal and how you're getting there as well, really, right?
So that definitely comes out of it. So one of the major benefits that I find of focusing on the problem and like committing to the problem is that by better understanding the problem, because you're focusing on it, because the conversations are around how do we solve this problem, you end up coming up with a much better strategy and a much better project plan because you're focusing on what is being solved, what is the problem we're actually trying to solve here, so that the how that is eventually produced is so much better because it's directly solving the problem. Because I feel like sometimes in projects some decision was made at some point and there was a belief that it was going to solve the problem, but maybe the real problem wasn't understood.
Mm.
Or maybe what the problem was changed over time, and so what the project is now doing is not solving that original problem. And in that territory you kind of get the risk of sunk cost fallacy, where if you're no longer solving that original problem, should you continue that project, or do you need to make some changes there?
Right. Well, I've I've been pondering this, and I think in terms of, obviously, I think it work in any project, but I think mostly what would inspire me most is maybe in the nonprofit sector, charity sector. You're working on a problem. You're working to solve a particular, issue in a particular region or a particular, school or event or community. So the needs of that community, of that audience, may shift. And you have to understand really in depth what that problem is. So coming at it, and like you kind of said earlier too, you like the hybrid PM style. You can't necessarily go in with a prescribed methodology either, because that will have some inherent biases as well, right? Like you can't, it's going to set you up in a certain way. And if you just follow that blindly, you're not necessarily going to be able to solve the problem.
Definitely. Yeah. And that's why it's so helpful to focus on like the problem and not the solution, because sometimes solutions, like what may be a great solution, does change. As you noted, the needs of the stakeholders may change, or additional solutions may present themselves, become available. And you don't want to stick to that original solution just because some decision was made at some point. You're really focusing on how are we going to solve this problem? What is the best way to solve this problem? And I definitely think it makes a lot of sense in the nonprofit sector. Any approach to project management, in my mind, should have the audience, the end user in mind. And that also kind of leads us into change management, where I think it's really important to make sure that all of the projects I implement are actually solving problems for those end users and are actually improving the well-being or the processes or whatever of those end users. Because to me, that's the definition of success. If we roll out a project that is completed, word for word, exactly as the project plan laid out, but then I talk to the end users and they tell me that this isn't an improvement, the project or the problem remains. To me, that's not successful. And also to me, that tells me we need to do more work. The project is not closed, or maybe this phase of the project is closed, but we need more, because the whole point is that we're trying to solve this problem for these people. It's not just that we're focusing on solving projects, basically. I don't want to ever just say, oh, well, the project is closed, so I'm done. That's not good enough for me.
Yeah, and fair, and I think that's a healthy and supportive attitude. I think I like how you also mentioned change management, because it's really projects, almost any project. I can't think of an example that's not right now, but most projects are about change. You're trying to get from phase A to phase B and change a behavior or something, or just change a process or something like that. So interesting element, because you really need to deeply understand the needs of, again, those users or that community, whatever that audience is, to get there. And if you skip any of that, one thing that I've talked a bit about on this before and many other places, but is that whole notion, a phrase I've adopted and loved, because nothing about us without us. You can't develop a project plan without the input of the people it's really going to impact. And so I think this speaks well, or speaks to that issue as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. I've actually heard you use that quote before, and I really like it, because I definitely think, like, I've worked on a lot of change management projects. And so I learned early that, yes, you definitely have to involve the stakeholders. Otherwise, you're going to experience much higher change resistance, which, if I'd have to choose between a project with high resistance and low resistance, I would definitely want low resistance, because it will be easier and generally less stressful. But that's also why I like this approach of, focusing on the problem and not the solution. Because if you really understand the problem that you're trying to solve and you are focused and committed to solving it, I find that stakeholders respond better, especially if you're dealing with expert stakeholders, because they are often the ones that, in my experience, can give very high resistance, because they have high expectations, because they're experts in their fields and they know what they're talking about, and they're used to talking to people who don't know what they're talking about. And so, if I can prove to those people as the project manager that I am committed to solving this problem, and, I'm asking all these questions, I'm getting involved, I'm investing time into fully understanding, like, a 360 view of what this problem is, what options are to solve it. Those stakeholders are more likely to become my allies and get engaged in the project, because they see that mindset and that attitude as positive and like productive. Whereas most people have experiences of, nightmare project managers where they don't listen to people and they are
That
just
doesn't
there to do the
happen.
project and leave. And I fully understand that like people have bad experiences, um, and you have to be patient as a project manager because resistance is going to happen, but like you also have to understand and appreciate why it's happening. If someone had bad experience previously, you have to overcome that. You have to work to prove that you're not that person. And I think just like, having this kind of focus and being productive and again, just focusing on improving the outcome for those end users, whoever they are, often these experts, it's a lot easier to win them over.
Yeah, it's the human element, and I think that's what I mean. We've all seen it. You've just alluded to it too. That the some project managers who really are about the project, the process, making us get from A to B, and they'll get there no matter what. But there's the human element, the relationships that are so significant to make it successful, and to build those relationships to make sure that everybody has a good understanding, because it's so much easier to negotiate any change in scope or change in budget or change in schedule if you have a good rapport with somebody, and they know you, and they know you're not just making stuff up. It's like, Rosemary, we got to delay this a month because of this and this and this, and you might not be happy about it, but you're more willing to have a conversation about it because we trust each other and we have a good relationship. And that's really a critical part of this too, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think relationship management with stakeholders really can't be understated, because you never know when you're going to work with them next. It might be immediately after this project is over. So you don't want to be burning bridges.
Yeah.
But also, like some of the hardest points in a project, if you have good relationships and good rapport with your key stakeholders, it's going to make those challenging moments that much easier. Like if you have stakeholders who are engaged and involved during the project planning, for instance, it's going to make that process a lot faster and a lot more robust. If I create a project plan myself without the input of any stakeholders, it's not going to be as accurate, as detailed, as good as if I am getting all of the key stakeholders together and understanding from their perspective, what are the challenges, what are the risks that we anticipate, what are opportunities that we might be able to take advantage of, when inevitably a project has to pivot because things happen that we didn't predict. It always happens. I want to say if we have to pivot, but realistically, it's when.
Yeah.
If you have people to rely on to help you figure out, okay, this thing happened, we have to like get a tiger team together, just rally up the troops, figure out how we're going to deal with this immediately. And it can make a very stressful situation be just an exercise in, thinking quickly and acting quickly and just getting the right people together. Whereas if you don't have that relationship with them, it's, they're not going to prioritize it in the same way that you are, where even if you're panicking, they're like, well, I have these other things that I need to do. Sorry, like your project just isn't my priority.
Yeah. Well, I wonder if you could explain a bit kind of your before and after, like as a project manager, when you discovered this notion, and I'm assuming you kind of probably were leaning in that direction anyway, but when you discovered this notion of loving the problem and really working the problem and not focusing so much on the solution, what how's this really been helpful to you as a project manager in evolving your own skill set?
That's a really good question. You're right. I've definitely always been very problem focused. I've always been a problem solver to a fault. When you have those conversations where you're talking to someone, you just want to complain and they keep trying to solve your problems. That was me before I realized, okay, not everyone wants that.
Yeah, I do
Um,
that.
maybe it's the nature of a project manager.
Yeah.
I don't know. But I think it's like anything else. When you get that right quote, or when you formalize something, or get a specific diagnosis where everything just clicks into place, where you're like, oh, that's why I was feeling like this, or that's why I was trying to do this, or that's why this wasn't working. And so, I would peg this as like, it's just a formalization of my existing like mentality and my existing beliefs. Like same thing as when I learned about change management. I was doing change management well before I heard the term, but when I learned about it, it was like, oh, that's what it's called. And so, having that quote or, that term, it makes it a lot easier to share, I would say, versus if I try to share my mindset or my working process, it can be very hard to pin it down to one specific area. Whereas now I can say falling in love with the problem and not the solution. And I think it's like anything else when you have mindsets, it also makes decision making easier.
Mhm.
Or like, approaching a new problem, because I can just go back to my toolkit, which is, focus on the problem. As you're getting to know this project, do you feel like you know the problem well enough? Are we actually solving the problem? And so it makes it, I would say, probably easier to get projects started, because I know how I'm going to be approaching these things. Even if it's a new type of problem, it's still just a problem.
I'm wondering if you can give us an example, something that maybe you've really shined, or your team has really shined in terms of taking this approach and this perspective on things. Is there a particular project maybe in mind that is a great example for you?
Yeah.
Or maybe naming
I have,
things and all that kind of stuff. But I'm just
yeah,
curious if
I
there's
have
something.
such a history. I have such a history of problem projects. It's hard to choose just one. So I have one specific project in mind where it's a bit of a bragging point, and I don't really like to brag, but this project, it had been kicked around between a lot of people, and no one wanted to lead it, which is never a good start. And by the end of it, I ended up implementing it within 1 quarter, which was pretty impressive because I had nothing at the beginning. Like there was no project plan. There wasn't even a clear understanding of like how it was going to be done. And it was also a fairly large scale project involving like 25,000 or so customers. Um, so essentially, someone had come to me, I think it was the head of operations, and they said, like, this isn't your realm, this isn't within your team's scope, but we just need someone to do this. And we think you can do it. And we frankly don't have anybody else. And so I was like, okay, let's have a conversation. And one of the key things about falling in love with the problem and not the solution is, as you said at the beginning, is like it's committing to the problem in a positive way. It's not avoidant about the problem. It's like almost celebrating it. I wouldn't have this opportunity if this problem didn't exist. I wouldn't have a project to implement if this problem didn't exist. And so, starting that type of project with that positive mindset where all of these other people probably just looked at it and said, no, I'm not doing that. Absolutely not. Like, this isn't my priority, or I don't want to do this, or I'm scared of it, or, any number
Yeah.
of like more negative attitudes. Uh, so that's the first step for that project, was really just approaching it from like, I'm committing to this problem. I'm not afraid of it. I'm going to get to know it. I'm going to become friends with it. I'm going to be hanging out with it for the next quarter or so. And so I might as well like it. Uh, and so I sat down with a few different people who were already accustomed to the problem. And my goal then was just to get to know it better and to fully understand what is the problem that we're currently facing. Out of these 25,000 customers, what is their perspective? What are we trying to solve for them? What is the outcome that we're imagining for them? Uh, and so the problem itself was, we needed to roll out this service to our customers. And some people already had the service, some people didn't. But for anyone who didn't have it, we wanted to make sure we weren't sending them the same comms as the people who were getting it, because that just looked really unprofessional. But we also were fighting against very poor data integrity. And so we weren't entirely sure who had it and who didn't. And lack of data integrity is not my favorite problem, and not really anyone's favorite problem. So, that was another challenge that we had to experience there. And no one was really sure how we were actually going to roll out these services, because typically it was done one by one, store by store, and by a completely different team. And we were looking at doing this like thousands of customers at a time. We weren't about to tackle, 25,000 customers doing everything manually. Uh, and so, from there, just like any project, it builds up and up. But you have to start with that core understanding of what is the problem, what is the crux of the problem that you're trying to solve, what is the most important thing, what is the mandatory aspect of the problem, and then just, kind of, it's cheesy, but like approaching with a can-do attitude. And like having positivity from the get-go, especially as the project manager, it really sets the tone for everyone else that you're working with. So the team that I was working with, they were aware that other people had said, I don't want to do this. They were well aware that this was a complicated problem. We had more unknowns than knowns. And so me coming in with this positive attitude and basically like refusing to accept the negativity, I eventually won them over, and they were like, oh, we are actually making progress, like we're doing it. And that whole like involvement from the team members is ultimately why I was able to get this done in 1 quarter, and turn this really problem project into like kind of a bragging point where it was like,
Yeah.
why were we ever stressed about this? Why was this ever blown out of proportion? Because that's another thing, is like sometimes with problems, we think they're way bigger than they are. And until you actually get to know them, or like, you're thinking they're bigger than they are because there's negativity, there's like anxiety, or just stress, around it. Whereas if you approach things with positivity, you're not having to fight against anything. You're just embracing things as they are, which also ends up being less stress and makes things easier in general to roll out that type of project.
Yeah, and it's it seems so simple, right? Say, hey, go into this with a positive attitude. Go get them, kid. It's like that, right? But that itself can be a challenge, because there are going to be points in there where you're like, oh, this isn't working, or oh, another challenge, or this just exploded. There's always going to be another thing that kind of comes maybe from out of nowhere that you weren't anticipating. But I think as much as you can, be mindful, and I think that's a great key for any project manager, is just general mindfulness, right? Be awareness of how you're feeling, how you're reacting to things, and that can be contagious in a good way to the rest of the team, because once you're demonstrating that, yep, this is a challenge, pretty sure we can figure this one out though, and you keep going. So I think it really speaks to just attitudinal shifts, that especially in a project like you're describing, right? Nobody wanted this thing, looks like a real pain in the butt, but we're going to try and tackle it anyway. And obviously you pulled it off because you had a unique perspective, and maybe just a unique and new way of doing things that they weren't expecting either. So sometimes just that fresh view on things is enough to really change and make it successful.
Mhm. I think it's very easy to come into a project and experience like a crisis of confidence, where you
Mhm.
think, I've never done this before. I don't think I can do this. And I've certainly experienced that. I've probably experienced that with this project, because I really hadn't done anything like this, and we had a very short time frame. But like, there are a few things to keep in mind. First of all, like, you always experience that I've never done this before you do something for the first time. Like, you have to just get used to that feeling. You have to get used to not being 100% confident, 100% comfortable. Like, you shouldn't be aiming for that. You should just be open to taking on challenges. Another thing is that, like, you're not alone. Like, in this project, I had so many amazing team members who were supporting this project, just none of them had project management skill set. And so they collectively, they all had the answers to this big problem. My goal, or my role, was really just to get the answers out of each of them, and then put it all together and create a cohesive project plan, and guide the project toward that. um I had another point on this one.
That's okay.
Can't remember. It slipped out of my mind.
It's okay. It's okay. You're doing great. We just had a question though from the room. Mel was asking, what do you do when the project owner or executive sponsor, the timeline is unrealistic? In a situation like that, maybe I'm not sure. You seem to maybe fast track that example and got it done maybe ahead of schedule. But what if once you start digging into this project, you realize the expectations are really just not in the realm of reality.
It's never an easy conversation to tell someone that they have unrealistic expectations. Like, even that statement, it would probably trigger them. So, you have to find a soft way of saying that. In general, I find that the best way to have those conversations is to prove it. Like, don't just tell them this is unrealistic. You need to show them, like, here's what the original scope of the project was, and each of these individual pieces is going to take this amount of time. Here are the resources that we have. 1 + 1 cannot equal 5. And from that point, you can have a conversation around what levers can we pull. It's very classic in an agile project where it's about what are the highest priority items that we can deliver within this time set based on the resources we have. And so in that sense, you would just cut down some of the scope to focus on the highest priority items, or you would expand that timeline. But if the timeline is the thing that has to stay as is and can't be moved, you can also look at resources to say, starting from the perspective of, based on our current resources, based on our current project plan, we cannot hit this timeline. Can we have more resources? Here's the amount of resources that we would anticipate needing.
Yeah.
Or, if this project maybe needs to be prioritized higher than some of the project managers or some of the project members' other projects, that's also potentially a lever that can be pulled to make sure that they are working, full time on this project instead of whatever else they might have going on.
Yeah, I think that's very reasonable answer. What I find, what I have found over the years is, a sponsor, an executive needs to communicate sometimes a little better with the team. They're at an executive table. We need these 12 new projects that popped up. Bob puts his hand up and says, yeah, we can do that. And then his team says, no, no, we can't. Right. So you have to have those communications lines really open to make sure that the original idea is realistic. And as things change, to make sure that the estimates and the scope can evolve with that as well.
I think another really good approach to that conversation is also to ask them why this timeline is rigid, because they may think that something has to be rigid, but actually it doesn't, or it may identify another opportunity, or it may show you that actually the whole project doesn't need to be delivered within this time frame. It's just like one aspect of the project, and they're saying the whole project because they don't understand that nuance, whereas you would as the project manager.
That's true, and that's the beauty of the whole agile system. I love that image of, I'm sure you've seen it, but like describing agile as the skateboard versus the bicycle versus the car, kind of evolving up. It is going to get you where you need to go, but this is what we can do within timeline 1. Here's what we can do in timeline 2, and in timeline 3, you'll have everything you want. But at each phase, you get something that's going to help you. It just might not be perfect yet.
Yeah. I think sometimes that can be difficult to express to executives because, like, sometimes we come in from the mindset of everyone's a project manager. And so if I just use the word agile, they'll automatically know what I'm talking about, or they'll automatically understand this is how agile works and that we commit to a certain amount of work per week. It's not the traditional waterfall. And I think that's also another danger in project management in general, is just like assumptions. I try to stay away from assumptions as much as possible and over communicate in situations to make sure that what I'm thinking and my mindset, my thinking down the road is aligning with everyone else. And if we're not, they're going to realize, because I'm over explaining, they're like, oh, wait a minute, this thing you said that doesn't actually make sense. And so we can actually have that conversation, because I feel like assuming is it's such a danger, and it's like an invisible danger until
Yeah.
something happens, and it's like, oh, but you said this. Oh, but I thought this.
I love that you said over communicate, because I do that all the time. And it's and I find that some folks will get frustrated with that because they have, an urgency maybe to get a decision made or something like that. And I can respect that as well. But sometimes it's like, look, yes, you have an urgency, but so do these 13 other people, and they all have slightly different perspectives and slightly different needs. So we really need to, put all these bits and pieces together to build this plan or whatever it is. So yeah, I'm glad you said over communicate. That's part of my signature style, I would say, in terms of getting people all on the same page and everybody understood, and making sure all those gotchas come out as early as possible.
Honestly, if you ever need someone to like soundboard or just sanity check and be like, am I over communicating? The answer is yes, but you need to over communicate because, yeah, you want to avoid these assumptions. And I also just feel like over communicating is in line with like proactive communications. And that's also part of project planning, right? It's important to tell people things beforehand so that other things can be planned around instead of just telling them, if I message you and say like, hey, I need this done immediately, can you just start working on this? It's not realistic. You
Yeah.
need to give people time. You need to give people heads up.
So on that note, maybe Rose, maybe we can wrap it there. But I really want to say thank you so much for taking the time to talk today. I really enjoyed the conversation. I enjoyed this topic. Again, the phrase "loving the problem, not the solution" has been kind of a light bulb for me. So I'm grateful to you for sharing that with me, and now for everybody else out there on the interweb who can learn from this too. So thanks very much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. And Mel, thank you so much for coming. You had a great question. I appreciate you getting involved here. Yeah, thank you so much, Kevin, for having me. This was a blast.